The air was still, heavy with a silence that felt alive, as though the world itself held its breath. Enoch knelt by the ancient cedar tree, his head bowed in quiet prayer. His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a man who spoke not out of obligation but from the marrow of his soul. The stars above seemed to glimmer more brightly in response, as if the heavens recognized his voice. Enoch was no ordinary man. His neighbors whispered of his righteousness, his unshakable faith, and the way his presence brought peace to even the most troubled hearts. Yet he sought no recognition. His days were spent tending the land, teaching his children, and listening for the faint, sacred whispers of something far greater than himself. He believed life was not just a gift but a responsibility, and each moment should honor the one who had given it. But that night, as he rose from his knees, a strange sensation prickled the back of his neck. The wind stirred suddenly, though there had been none before. The trees, towering and ancient, swayed as if bowing to an unseen force. Then came a light, not blinding, but pure and gentle, filling the space around him with an ethereal glow. Enoch froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. A voice, deep and resonant, called his name. Enoch, beloved of the Most High. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the night with a power that made the ground tremble. Enoch turned slowly, and there they stood, figures cloaked in radiance, their faces beyond human comprehension yet somehow bearing a kindness that set his fear at ease. They were angels, their forms shimmering like molten gold, their presence overwhelming and yet deeply comforting. "You are chosen," said one of them, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the very stars. "The Most High has seen your faithfulness, your purity of heart. You will bear witness to things hidden from the eyes of men. You will see what has been, what is, and what shall come. Do not fear." Enoch opened his mouth to respond, but his words caught in his throat. He could only nod, his hands trembling at his sides. The lead angel stepped forward and placed a hand, if it could be called a hand, on Enoch's shoulder. Instantly, a surge of warmth coursed through him, calming his trembling limbs. "Your guide will come. Prepare yourself." As suddenly as they appeared, the angels vanished, leaving Enoch alone beneath the star-strewn sky. Yet the silence no longer felt empty. It thrummed with a new energy, a promise that the ordinary fabric of his life had been irrevocably torn. The next day, as Enoch tended his fields, the world seemed sharper, more vivid. The greens of the grass, the rustle of the leaves, even the hum of insects, it all felt alive with a significance he couldn't quite name. He worked in a state of quiet anticipation, his mind replaying the angel's words over and over. When the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson, he felt it again, that prickling at the back of his neck. This time, the light was blinding, a column of brilliance descending from the heavens. Enoch shielded his eyes as the figure emerged. This was no ordinary angel. The being was colossal, his presence more commanding than the others, his eyes like burning coals. His robes shimmered with hues that shifted like waves on the ocean, and his face held the authority of one who had stood at the dawn of creation. "I am Uriel," the angel announced, his voice as steady and unyielding as a mountain. "I have come to take you where no mortal has walked." Enoch felt his knees buckle beneath him, but Uriel extended a hand, lifting him effortlessly. "Do not fear," the angel said, his tone softening. "The Most High has prepared you for this. You are stronger than you believe." Before Enoch could gather his thoughts, Uriel raised his other hand, and the world around them began to shift. The air rippled like water, and a sound like rushing wind filled Enoch's ears. He gasped as the ground beneath him dissolved, replaced by a vast expanse of light and shadow swirling together in chaotic harmony. "Look," Uriel commanded, pointing into the distance. Shapes began to form within the swirling mists, towering mountains, roaring rivers, valleys cloaked in darkness. Enoch's heart raced as he realized he was no longer standing on the earth he knew. This was a place beyond comprehension, a tapestry of wonders and terrors that seemed to stretch into eternity. As they moved forward, Enoch found himself unable to look away. His breath caught as he saw immense structures carved into the sides of cliffs, glowing with an inner light. He saw rivers that seemed to flow upward, their currents defying the laws of nature. He saw forests where the trees bore fruit that shimmered like jewels, and he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. "Where are we?" Enoch managed to whisper, his voice trembling. "You stand at the threshold of creation," Uriel replied. "These are the places hidden from mortal sight, the foundations of the earth and the heavens." They walked, or perhaps floated, Enoch couldn't tell, through a canyon where the air seemed alive with whispers. The walls were etched with symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Enoch reached out to touch them, but Uriel's voice stopped him. "Not yet. These are the records of the Watchers, those who once served the Most High but chose rebellion. Their sins are carved here for all eternity." The name struck Enoch like a blow. The Watchers. He had heard of them in the ancient stories, angels who had descended to earth, seduced by human women, and taught forbidden knowledge to mankind. Their actions had brought corruption and chaos, and their punishment had been swift and terrible. Enoch shuddered, imagining the wrath of the Creator falling upon those who had turned from his light. "Why me?" Enoch asked, his voice barely audible. "Why was I chosen to see this?" Uriel paused, his fiery gaze softening. "Because you are faithful. Because you will not look upon these things with pride or judgment, but with humility and understanding. You will bear witness so that others may know the justice and mercy of the Most High." Enoch nodded, though his mind still reeled. He could feel the weight of the task before him, a burden that was both humbling and terrifying. As they continued, the air grew colder, and the light around them dimmed. Uriel placed a hand on Enoch's shoulder, steadying him. "What you see next will test your spirit," the angel warned. "Be strong." Enoch took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he could not turn back. The wind howled through the night, carrying with it a strange, otherworldly chill. Enoch stood at the base of the mountain, his heart pounding as he gazed upward. The peak was shrouded in mist, its jagged edges illuminated faintly by the light of a crescent moon. The air was alive with a presence he couldn't name, a weight pressing against his chest that made each breath feel heavier than the last. He tightened his cloak around his shoulders, though he knew it wasn't the cold making him shiver. Uriel stood beside him, his radiant form stark against the darkened landscape. The angel's gaze was fixed on the summit, his expression unreadable. Without a word, Uriel began to ascend, his movements deliberate and steady. Enoch hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the path ahead clawing at his resolve, but the thought of turning back felt impossible. He took his first step, the rocky ground beneath his sandals sharp and unforgiving. Each step seemed to stretch time, the climb pulling him further from the world he knew. The air thinned, and with it came a strange stillness, as though the mountain had drawn him into its own rhythm, separate from the passage of ordinary days. The stars above grew brighter, their light sharp and cold, as though watching him with unblinking eyes. His legs burned with effort, but he pressed on, guided by the steady presence of Uriel ahead of him. As they neared the summit, the mist thickened, curling around them like ghostly tendrils. Enoch could feel it clinging to his skin, not damp but charged with an energy that made his hair stand on end. He paused to catch his breath, his chest heaving, when the sound reached him, a low hum, so faint it could have been imagined. It grew louder with each passing moment, a vibration that seemed to come from within the mountain itself. The ground beneath his feet trembled faintly, and the rocks glowed with a dim, golden light. Uriel turned to him, his fiery eyes piercing through the mist. "We are here," the angel said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. Enoch looked around, confusion flickering across his face. The summit appeared barren, nothing but jagged rocks and swirling mist. Then Uriel raised his hand, and the air around them shifted. The hum grew louder, transforming into a melody, a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from every direction. The ground beneath Enoch's feet seemed to ripple, and before him, the rock split apart with a thunderous crack. A chasm opened, its edges glowing with an unearthly light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Enoch's knees buckled as he gazed into the depths. The chasm was not darkness, as he had expected, but a kaleidoscope of color and light, swirling and shifting like the surface of a restless sea. He could feel its pull, a force that seemed to reach into his very soul, beckoning him forward. Uriel stepped to the edge, his expression serene. "This is the threshold," Uriel said. "The path you must walk. Beyond lies the foundation of all things, the balance that sustains creation." Enoch swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He wanted to ask questions, to grasp the enormity of what lay before him, but his voice failed him. Instead, he nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. Uriel extended his hand. "Take courage, Enoch. What lies ahead is not for the faint of heart. But you were chosen for this." Enoch reached out, his hand trembling as it met Uriel's. The angel's grip was strong, steadying him. Together, they stepped into the chasm. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Enoch felt as though he were falling, yet he remained upright, his feet moving forward without his control. The light around him engulfed him, warm and cold all at once, its brilliance searing his eyes even as it filled him with an indescribable peace. Shapes began to form within the light, vast, intricate structures that seemed to pulse with life. He saw towering columns of flame that rose into infinity, rivers of silver light that flowed through the air, and orbs of fire spinning in perfect harmony. The sound of wings filled the air, 1,000 voices blending in a song that Enoch couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. He turned his head, and his breath caught. Angels filled the space around him, their forms varying from radiant and humanoid to vast and incomprehensible. Some were cloaked in fire, their wings stretching far beyond his vision, while others shimmered like polished gold, their bodies adorned with countless eyes that seemed to see everything at once. They moved in precise, fluid patterns, their harmony a testament to an order that Enoch could only begin to grasp. Uriel's voice cut through the awe that had consumed him. "Behold the hierarchy, the balance of light and shadow that sustains creation. Each being here moves in accordance with the will of the Most High, their purpose woven into the fabric of existence." Enoch's gaze fell to the lower reaches of the chasm, where the light began to dim. There, the shapes grew darker, less defined, and he felt a chill creep into his heart. He saw forms that writhed and twisted, their outlines broken and jagged, as though they were struggling against some invisible force. These beings did not sing. Instead, a low, mournful wail rose from them, a sound that filled Enoch with both pity and fear. "The fallen," Uriel said softly, his gaze following Enoch's. "Once they shone as brightly as the others, but they chose rebellion. Their song turned to discord, their light to shadow. Now they are bound, their power diminished, but their presence remains a reminder of what was lost." Enoch tore his eyes away, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had seen. He looked to Uriel, his voice shaking as he asked, "Why would they choose this? To turn away from such glory?" Uriel's expression grew somber. Pride. The desire to rise above their place, to claim what was never theirs to take. It began with a single thought, a spark of defiance, and it spread like fire. Such is the nature of rebellion, it consumes, even as it promises freedom. They continued their descent, the light around them growing fainter with each step. Enoch felt the air grow colder, heavier, and the weight of the chasm pressed against him like an unseen hand. Yet Uriel's presence remained steady, a beacon of strength that kept him moving forward. As they reached the plateau, Enoch turned to look back. The view was breathtaking, a vast, intricate web of light and shadow stretching in every direction, each thread connected to the next in perfect balance. He realized that this was no mere descent into the earth, this was the foundation of everything, the unseen forces that shaped the world above. Uriel placed a hand on Enoch's shoulder, his gaze steady. "What you see here is only the beginning. The balance must be maintained, but it is fragile. That is why you are here, Enoch. To witness, to understand, and to carry the truth with you." Enoch's heart swelled with both awe and trepidation. He turned back to the path ahead, his resolve firm. There was no turning back now. The heat was oppressive, pressing against Enoch like an invisible wall. His skin prickled, his breath came in shallow gasps, and the very air seemed to shimmer, bending light in unnatural ways. The ground beneath his feet was no longer stone but an expanse of fiery embers, glowing with an intensity that made it difficult to look directly at them. Each step felt precarious, as though the earth might crumble and drag him into the inferno beneath. Uriel walked ahead, undeterred by the searing environment, his form radiating calm authority. Enoch followed, his body trembling but his resolve unbroken. The faint sound of crackling fire filled his ears, but underneath it, there was something else, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise and fall with the flickering of the embers. It was a sound that tugged at his soul, a melody of despair that felt almost alive. Ahead, the horizon seemed to shift, revealing shapes emerging from the fiery haze. As they drew closer, Enoch's heart sank. Towering figures were bound in chains of shimmering light, their forms impossibly large yet contorted as if under immense strain. Their faces, once beautiful and majestic, were etched with anguish, their eyes burning with a mixture of sorrow and fury. These were no ordinary prisoners, they were angels, their radiance dimmed but not extinguished. "Here stand the Watchers," Uriel said, his voice heavy with meaning. "Those who turned from the path of the Most High and fell into darkness. They are bound here until the appointed time." Enoch's gaze lingered on the nearest figure, whose chains glowed as if alive, pulsing with energy that seemed to restrain his very essence. The angel's wings, once magnificent, were scorched and tattered, hanging limp against his back. He lifted his head slowly, and his eyes met Enoch's. A chill ran through him, though the air around them burned. "Who are you?" the angel asked, his voice hoarse but still laced with a resonance that hinted at his former glory. "Why do you walk freely in this place of torment?" Enoch hesitated, the weight of the question pressing on him. He glanced at Uriel, who nodded, granting silent permission to speak. "I am Enoch," he said, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry his words. "I have been sent to bear witness." The angel's lips curved into a bitter smile. "To witness," he repeated, the words dripping with irony. "A mortal, sent to gaze upon our ruin. Tell me, Enoch, do you understand what you see?" Enoch shook his head, his throat tightening. "No," he admitted softly. "I see your suffering, but I do not understand why." The angel leaned forward as far as his chains allowed, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. "We were once as you are now, unbroken, whole, pure in purpose. We stood in the presence of the Most High, our voices a part of the great symphony that holds creation together. But we wanted more." His voice faltered, and for a moment, the sorrow in his eyes seemed to eclipse the fire around him. "It began with a thought," he continued, his tone quieter now, as if speaking to himself. "A flicker of desire. To walk among men, to taste what was forbidden to us. We descended, believing we could take what we wished and still remain untarnished." Enoch's chest tightened. "And the women?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had heard the stories, the whispers of angels who had fallen for mortal women, bringing chaos to the earth. The angel's face twisted, a mixture of longing and regret. "We loved them," he said, the words heavy with pain. "Or so we told ourselves. But love without obedience is no love at all, it is selfishness, a flame that consumes rather than warms. We taught them things they were never meant to know, secrets that were not ours to share. We became the architects of corruption." Enoch felt a tear slip down his cheek, unbidden. He wanted to look away, to shut out the anguish in the angel's voice, but he couldn't. "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice trembling. The angel laughed, a sound so hollow it made Enoch's heart ache. "Worth it? Look around you, mortal. Do you see glory here? Do you see joy? We are bound, not because the Most High is cruel, but because we cannot undo what we have done. Our fall was not a single act, it was a choice repeated with every breath, every heartbeat. And now, we are left with the echoes of what we once were." Another voice, sharper and more defiant, broke through the haze. "Do not let his words fool you, mortal," it growled. Enoch turned to see another angel, his chains rattling as he struggled against them. His eyes burned with fury, and his voice was like the crack of thunder. We fell because we dared to challenge the tyranny of the Most High. We sought freedom, and for that, we were cast down. Uriel stepped forward, his presence commanding. You sought power, Azazel, he said, his voice ringing with authority. Not freedom. Your pride led you to betray the very balance you were sworn to uphold. Azazel snarled, his chains sparking as he strained against them. And what is freedom without power? To serve endlessly, without question, without desire, that is not life. It is bondage. Enoch watched the exchange, his mind reeling. He could feel the tension between them, a clash of wills that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. Yet even in Azazel's defiance, there was a note of desperation, a shadow of the torment that consumed him. Uriel turned to Enoch, his gaze softening. Do you see now why they are bound? Their fall was not merely an act of rebellion, it was a fracture in the order of creation. They sought to take what was not theirs, and in doing so, they brought ruin upon themselves and the world. Enoch nodded slowly, the weight of what he had witnessed settling over him like a heavy cloak. He turned back to the first angel, whose eyes now glistened with tears. Is there hope for you? He asked, his voice barely audible. The angel smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth in the midst of his suffering. Hope is not for us to claim, Enoch. It lies with the Most High. But if you carry anything from this place, let it be this: our fall was not inevitable. It was a choice. One that can still be avoided by those who walk in the light. The fire around them flared suddenly, the embers glowing brighter as if in response to his words. Enoch felt his heart swell with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. He bowed his head, his thoughts racing as Uriel placed a hand on his shoulder. It is time, Uriel said softly. There is more to see. Enoch took a shaky breath, his gaze lingering on the chained angels as they receded into the fiery haze. Their suffering, their regret, their defiance, it all lingered in his heart, a weight he knew he would carry for the rest of his days. But he followed Uriel, his steps steady, his resolve unbroken. The path ahead awaited him. The air was heavy with silence, yet it pulsed with an unspoken presence. Enoch stepped cautiously into a vast, shadowed expanse, his senses overwhelmed by the immensity of what lay before him. Columns of light pierced the darkness, stretching endlessly upward, their glow soft yet unwavering. Between them, the space seemed alive, shifting with whispers too faint to understand. He shivered, though the air was neither cold nor warm. It was something else, something beyond the comprehension of flesh and bone. Uriel's voice broke the stillness. This is the chamber of souls. Enoch's breath caught in his throat. As his eyes adjusted, he began to see them. Thousands upon thousands of figures, luminous and ethereal, suspended in the space between the columns. They floated, unmoving, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. Each spirit shimmered like a flame caught in the wind, its light pulsing gently, as if breathing. The air carried their presence, filling the chamber with a weight that pressed against Enoch's heart. He took a step forward, his feet silent on the ground that seemed neither stone nor air. The figures closest to him began to take shape, their faces emerging from the glow. Some appeared serene, their features soft and peaceful, while others bore expressions of longing, their eyes wide with hope or sorrow. Each one seemed to carry a story, a life etched into their very essence, and Enoch felt the weight of countless lives pressing against his own. Who are they? He whispered, his voice trembling. They are the righteous, Uriel replied. Those who lived with hearts turned toward the Most High. They await the day when all things will be made new, when judgment will bring fulfillment to their purpose. Enoch stepped closer to one of the glowing figures, his hand instinctively reaching out. The spirit did not move, but its light flickered, and for a moment, he felt something, a rush of emotions that were not his own. Joy, sorrow, love, loss. It was as though he had glimpsed an entire life in an instant, a thread woven into the tapestry of existence. They wait, he asked, his voice barely audible. Uriel nodded. Time is not as you know it here. For them, it is but a moment. Yet their longing is real, their hope unshaken. They trust in the promise that was given, the promise of restoration. Enoch's eyes wandered across the chamber, taking in the sheer vastness of it. The spirits stretched endlessly in every direction, their light forming a constellation that seemed to rival the heavens themselves. But as he gazed deeper, he noticed something else. Some of the figures were dimmer, their light flickering like a flame on the verge of being extinguished. "What of those?" he asked, his heart heavy. Uriel's expression darkened, his gaze following Enoch's. "They are the ones who strayed, yet found their way back before their end. Their light is faint because their lives were marked by both faith and failure. But even so, they are counted among the righteous. The Most High does not forget even a single act of repentance." Enoch swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to ask more, to understand the mysteries unfolding before him, but his thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a soft, melodic hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the chamber. It grew louder, more defined, until it became clear that it was not a single sound, but many, a chorus of voices, rising and falling in perfect harmony. The spirits were singing. The song was unlike anything Enoch had ever heard. It was not a melody of words, but of essence, each note carrying a weight that resonated in his soul. It was a song of longing and hope, of faith and waiting. It spoke of promises yet to be fulfilled, of a future so bright it eclipsed even the radiance of their current state. Tears streamed down Enoch's face as he listened, his heart breaking and mending all at once. "They sing of what is to come," Uriel said, his voice soft. "Of the day when all things will be made whole." Enoch turned to Uriel, his voice thick with emotion. "And they wait here, all of them, for that day?" "Yes," Uriel said, his gaze steady. "Their faith has brought them to this place, and their faith sustains them. For the Most High is faithful, and his promises are sure." As the song continued, Enoch's eyes fell on a single figure, its light brighter than the rest. It seemed to glow with an inner fire, its presence commanding yet gentle. He stepped closer, drawn to it, and as he did, the spirit turned its face toward him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Enoch felt a wave of peace wash over him, a peace so profound it silenced the turmoil in his heart. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Uriel smiled faintly. "Some shine brighter because their faith was unshakable, even in the face of unimaginable trials. This one endured much, yet never faltered. Their light is a testament to the strength of the human spirit when it is aligned with the will of the Most High." Enoch's hand rested over his chest, where his heart thudded in awe and sorrow. He wanted to speak, to ask more questions, but the song swelled again, its beauty overwhelming him. The chamber seemed to pulse with its power, the light of the spirits growing brighter, their forms blending into a single, radiant glow. For a moment, Enoch forgot himself. He was no longer a man standing in a strange, otherworldly place. He was part of something greater, a thread in a vast tapestry that stretched beyond the limits of his understanding. He felt the love of the Most High surrounding him, a love so pure and infinite it made the weight of his mortal life seem insignificant. Then, slowly, the song began to fade. The light dimmed, and Enoch found himself standing once more in the vast hall, the spirits still and silent. His heart ached with the loss of the song, but its echo lingered within him, a flame that would not be extinguished. Uriel placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm yet comforting. "You have seen what lies ahead for those who walk in the light. But there is more to witness, more to understand." Enoch nodded, his voice caught in his throat. He turned back for one last look at the spirits, their forms glowing softly in the stillness. Each one carried a story, a life that mattered, a hope that would not be forgotten. The sound was deafening, an endless roar that filled every corner of existence. Enoch clung to Uriel's arm, his knees trembling as he stared into the churning chaos before him. The abyss stretched endlessly, an ocean of black, swirling waters that moved as if alive, twisting and writhing with an energy that defied comprehension. Waves rose like mountains, crashing into one another, their collisions sending sprays of darkness into the air. Lightning streaked across the void, brief flashes illuminating the tumult before plunging everything back into shadow. There was no stillness here, no sense of order. The waters seemed to pulse with rage, their fury consuming all in their path. Enoch could feel it in his bones, a primal force, ancient and untamed, pressing against the very fabric of existence. His chest tightened, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tried to comprehend the vastness of it all. "This is the abyss," Uriel said, his voice steady but solemn. "The chaos that was before creation." Enoch turned to him, his eyes wide with fear. "It is alive," he whispered, though his voice was almost lost in the cacophony. Uriel nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling waters. "It is the formless void, the remnants of what existed before the Most High spoke light into being. It is power without purpose, motion without meaning. Left unchecked, it would consume all." A sudden gust of wind tore through the air, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay. Enoch staggered backward, his hand flying to his face to shield himself from the stinging spray. The waters seemed to react to his presence, their movements growing wilder, as if reaching for him. He felt their pull, a deep, relentless yearning that threatened to drag him into their depths. Uriel stepped forward, his presence a beacon of calm amidst the chaos. With a single motion of his hand, the waters recoiled, their fury subdued but not silenced. He turned to Enoch, his expression grave. The Most High set boundaries for the chaos, containing it with his will. Without those boundaries, there would be no land, no sky, no life. All would return to this. Enoch's knees gave way, and he sank to the ground, his hands clutching at the earth beneath him. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sight of the abyss, but its roar echoed in his mind, unrelenting. "How can such a thing exist?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How can it be controlled?" "It exists because it must," Uriel replied. "Creation is born from balance. Light cannot shine without darkness to define it, and order cannot prevail without chaos waiting at its edges. But the Most High alone holds the power to command it, to bind it so that life may flourish." As Uriel spoke, a massive wave rose from the abyss, towering higher than any mountain Enoch had ever seen. For a moment, it seemed as though it would collapse upon them, consuming everything in its path. But then it froze, suspended in the air as if held by invisible hands. Enoch stared in awe as the wave began to shimmer, its dark waters glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Slowly, it receded, sinking back into the abyss without a single drop spilling over. "This is his will," Uriel said, his voice low but firm. "It is not through force that chaos is contained, but through authority. The Most High speaks, and even the abyss must obey." Enoch's mind raced as he tried to grasp the enormity of what he was witnessing. The abyss was more than a physical place, it was a force, a reminder of the fragility of existence. He could feel its hunger, its longing to consume and destroy, yet it remained bound, its power tempered by something far greater. Uriel knelt beside him, his eyes searching Enoch's face. "Do you see now why the balance must be maintained? Why the Watchers' rebellion was so dangerous? They sought to take the power of the Most High for themselves, to wield it without understanding the cost. Had they succeeded, the chaos would have broken free, and all would have been undone." Enoch nodded weakly, his body trembling. He wanted to speak, to ask more questions, but the words would not come. Instead, he gazed into the abyss, its endless motion a stark contrast to the stillness within him. He could feel its power, its relentless energy, and he knew that he stood on the edge of something far greater than himself. The waters began to shift again, their movements slower now, more deliberate. As Enoch watched, he thought he saw shapes within them, faint outlines of figures, their forms distorted by the ever-changing currents. They seemed to reach out, their movements agonized, as though trapped in an eternal struggle against the chaos that surrounded them. "Are there souls within it?" he asked hesitantly, his voice barely audible. Uriel's expression darkened. "Not souls," he said. "Echoes. Fragments of what was lost when the chaos was first bound. They are neither alive nor dead, but they serve as a reminder of what once was, and what could be again, should the balance be broken." Enoch felt a chill run through him, despite the oppressive heat of the abyss. The thought of those echoes, trapped and struggling for eternity, filled him with a sorrow so deep it threatened to consume him. He turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. Uriel placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch grounding. "Do not let the abyss fill your heart with fear," he said. "Its power is great, but it is not without purpose. Even chaos has a role to play in the grand design." Enoch looked up at him, his eyes filled with questions he could not yet voice. Uriel offered a faint smile, his gaze steady. "There is more to see," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. Enoch nodded, his resolve returning. He rose to his feet, his body still shaking but his spirit unbroken. The roar of the abyss echoed in his ears as he turned away, its power lingering in his thoughts like a shadow. But he followed Uriel, trusting in the angel's guidance as they moved forward into the unknown. The air shimmered with a strange energy, an ethereal glow that seemed to come from nowhere yet illuminated everything. Enoch stood in silence, his eyes wide as he took in the sight before him. Suspended in the vast expanse of twilight were 7 radiant stars, their brilliance dimmed and their movement stilled, as though frozen in time. Each one pulsed faintly, their light flickering like a flame fighting against a relentless wind. Despite their beauty, there was a heaviness in the atmosphere, a sense of sorrow and loss that weighed on Enoch's heart. Uriel stood beside him, his face unreadable as he gazed at the celestial forms. "These are the rebellious stars," he said quietly. "Once they danced across the heavens in harmony, fulfilling their purpose as ordained by the Most High. But they chose another path, one of defiance." Enoch's breath caught in his throat. The stars hung in a perfect line, their positions unchanging, yet there was a palpable tension in their stillness. They seemed to radiate a silent anguish, as though aware of their imprisonment yet powerless to escape it. Enoch could feel their regret, their yearning to break free and shine as they once did, but something far greater held them in place. "Why did they rebel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Uriel's gaze remained fixed on the stars. They grew prideful, believing themselves greater than the order they were given. They sought to carve their own path, to impose their will upon creation. But such defiance cannot stand. The harmony of the heavens depends on obedience, on each star, each celestial being, fulfilling its role. Enoch's brow furrowed as he struggled to understand. He stepped closer to the stars, their faint light casting long shadows on the ground beneath him. He could feel their power, their brilliance muted but still immense, and he wondered how something so magnificent could fall so far. As he reached out a hand, a sudden voice echoed in his mind, not spoken aloud, yet clear as the tolling of a bell. Asterisk, "We were meant to shine brighter." Asterisk, the words were filled with pain and longing, their tone both defiant and mournful. Enoch pulled his hand back, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Uriel, his eyes wide. "They speak," he said. "I heard them." Uriel nodded solemnly. "Their voices linger, though their rebellion has silenced their freedom. They are bound by the very laws they sought to defy, their brilliance dimmed as a warning to all creation." Enoch's gaze returned to the stars, and he felt a pang of sorrow for them. He thought of their rebellion, their desire to shine brighter, and he wondered if they had truly understood the cost of their actions. "Do they regret it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Some do," Uriel replied. "But regret alone cannot undo what has been done. Their defiance disrupted the balance of the heavens, and their punishment ensures that such disorder will not spread." The stars pulsed again, their light flickering in unison. Enoch could feel their anguish, their longing for the freedom they once knew. He thought of the skies he had gazed at as a boy, the stars twinkling in perfect harmony, their beauty a reflection of the divine order. And yet, here before him were stars that had turned away from that order, their rebellion etched into the very fabric of their being. Uriel stepped forward, his voice steady. "There is a lesson here, Enoch. The heavens are not bound by chains, but by purpose. Each star, each planet, each being was created with a role to play, a place in the grand design. When even one piece turns away, the harmony is broken, and all of creation feels the strain." Enoch listened, his heart heavy with the weight of Uriel's words. He thought of the Watchers, their defiance leading to the corruption of humanity, and now these stars, their rebellion disrupting the order of the cosmos. He felt the interconnectedness of it all, the delicate balance that held creation together. As he stood there, the air seemed to grow colder, the light of the stars dimming further. Enoch could feel their sorrow deepening, their voices growing fainter, as though they were slipping away into the void. He wanted to reach out, to comfort them, but he knew that their pain was their own to bear. One star flickered brighter for a moment, its light piercing the darkness with a sudden intensity. Enoch could feel its determination, its refusal to fade completely. It was as if it was fighting against its fate, clinging to a hope that refused to be extinguished. Uriel's voice broke the silence. Even in rebellion, there is the faintest spark of redemption. The Most High's mercy extends beyond what you can comprehend, but it does not negate the consequences of disobedience. The stars remain bound, but their light serves as a reminder to the heavens, to the earth, and to you. Enoch's chest tightened, his emotions swirling within him. He felt pity for the stars, admiration for their beauty, and sorrow for their fall. He wanted to speak, to ask more questions, but the weight of the moment held him silent. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the faint light of the stars wash over him, their flickering glow a bittersweet melody that resonated in his soul. When he opened his eyes, Uriel was watching him, his expression unreadable. "Come," the angel said softly. "There is more to witness." Enoch hesitated, his gaze lingering on the stars. He felt as though they were watching him, their silent voices calling out to him, pleading for understanding. He wanted to stay, to listen, to learn their stories, but he knew that his path lay elsewhere. With a heavy heart, he turned away, following Uriel into the shadows. The light of the stars grew dimmer behind him, their voices fading into the silence. But their lesson remained, etched into his heart, a reminder of the beauty and fragility of order, and the price of rebellion. The heat was suffocating, a living force that wrapped around Enoch like unseen chains. His feet stood on the edge of a river unlike any he had ever seen. It did not flow with water, but with fire, liquid flames that surged and hissed, their currents twisting and writhing as though alive. The river's surface glowed an intense, pulsing red, streaked with flashes of golden light. Sparks rose into the air, forming fleeting shapes before dissolving into ash. Enoch stepped closer, his heart racing. The fire did not spread beyond the river's banks, contained as if by some unseen will. Yet its presence was overwhelming, a force that seemed to demand attention, to compel awe and fear in equal measure. The roar of the flames was not constant, it ebbed and flowed, creating a strange rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. Uriel stood beside him, unflinching. "This is the river of fire," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "It flows with the deeds of the wicked, each flame a memory, each current a consequence." Enoch's eyes widened as he peered into the blazing waters. At first, it seemed like chaos, a maelstrom of light and heat with no discernible pattern. But then he began to see the shapes within the flames. Faces appeared, twisted in anguish or frozen in despair, their features flickering in and out of existence. Scenes unfolded within the currents, moments of cruelty, betrayal, and greed playing out like shadows cast on a fiery screen. A cry erupted from the river, piercing and raw. Enoch recoiled, his hands flying to his ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them entirely, echoing directly in his mind. He turned to Uriel, his voice trembling. "What is this? Why do they scream?" "They scream because they are bound to the fire," Uriel replied. "This is not a punishment inflicted upon them by the Most High, but the consequence of their own actions. The river does not lie, it reflects what has been done and burns with the weight of those deeds." Enoch stared at the flames, his chest tightening. He saw a man within the current, his face contorted as he reached out, grasping for something unseen. Around him swirled images of wealth hoarded at the expense of the starving, hands taking what was not his to give, eyes blind to the suffering of others. The fire consumed him, yet he did not vanish, his torment unending as the river carried him forward. "Do they ever escape it?" Enoch asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Uriel's gaze remained fixed on the river. "The fire does not destroy, it purifies." It burns away the lies, the justifications, and the illusions that shielded them in life. Whether they escape depends on whether they can face the truth of their deeds and seek the grace that awaits those who repent. Enoch's heart ached as he watched the scenes unfold, one after another, each more harrowing than the last. A woman's face emerged, her tears mixing with the flames as images of betrayal surrounded her, the trust she had shattered now reflected in the fire's relentless embrace. A child's wail echoed in the distance, its source hidden but unmistakable, the sound a haunting reminder of innocence lost. Enoch turned away, his eyes burning not from the fire, but from the weight of what he was witnessing. How can this exist? How can such pain be allowed to endure? Uriel placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Pain is not the purpose of this river, though it is inevitable for those who find themselves within it. The fire reveals what was hidden, laying bare the truth so that none may claim ignorance. It is a path, not to destruction, but to understanding. The river shifted, its currents growing calmer, though the heat remained as intense as ever. Enoch saw a figure within the flames, standing still amidst the flow. Unlike the others, this one did not writhe or scream. His hands were clasped before him, his head bowed as if in prayer. Around him, the fire burned brighter, but it seemed less chaotic, its light almost gentle. Enoch watched in silence as the man raised his head. His face was etched with sorrow, but there was something else in his expression, a glimmer of hope, faint but unmistakable. The fire seemed to respond, its currents parting slightly to reveal a path ahead. The man stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, and the flames did not consume him. Instead, they seemed to guide him, their light illuminating his way. "What is happening?" Enoch asked, his voice filled with wonder. Uriel's expression softened. He has accepted the truth of his deeds and seeks redemption. The fire no longer burns to torment, but to cleanse. It becomes a passage, leading him toward what lies beyond. Enoch's chest swelled with a mixture of sorrow and awe. The river was no longer just a place of torment, it was a reflection of the choices that defined a life, a crucible where the weight of those choices could be confronted and, perhaps, overcome. He turned to Uriel, his voice steadier now. "Does everyone have that chance?" Uriel's gaze met his, unyielding but filled with an unmistakable compassion. The Most High's mercy extends to all, but the choice to seek it remains with each soul. The fire does not force, it reveals. What they do with that revelation is their own. Enoch's thoughts raced as he turned back to the river. The current surged once more, carrying countless figures along their blazing path. Each face, each scene was a story of choices made, lives lived, and the consequences that followed. Yet amidst the pain and despair, there was a glimmer of something more. In the heart of the fire, there was not only judgment, but the possibility of renewal. The flames roared louder, their light flickering across Enoch's face as he stood in silence. The river stretched endlessly before him, its currents carrying the weight of countless lives. And though the heat was relentless, he felt a strange calm wash over him, a sense of clarity that cut through the chaos. Uriel stood beside him, unshaken, his presence a steady anchor in the midst of the fiery torrent. Together, they watched as the river flowed on, its flames dancing with a light that was both terrible and beautiful, a reflection of all that had been and all that could yet be. The air carried a heavy stillness, a silence so profound it seemed to muffle even the sound of Enoch's heartbeat. Before him stretched a desolate expanse, a city unlike any he had ever seen. The structures were vast and dark, jagged as if carved from the bones of the earth itself. Shadows loomed, long and oppressive, as though the light of heaven dared not fall here. The city of the Watchers, a prison of divine design, pulsed with an energy that was both ancient and defiant. Uriel walked beside him, his steps unwavering. "They await within," the angel said, his tone grave. "Bound not only by chains, but by the weight of their deeds." Enoch swallowed hard, his feet heavy as he moved forward. The gates of the city loomed ahead, towering and wrought of some material that shimmered like molten metal, though it remained cold. As they passed through, Enoch's breath caught. Beyond the gates lay figures, tall, imposing, their forms marked by a terrible beauty that had not faded despite their fall. Each was bound, their wrists shackled with chains that shimmered faintly, emitting a light that seemed to hum with divine power. His gaze was drawn to one figure in particular, seated upon a great blackened stone at the heart of the city. The Watcher's eyes burned with a fierce light, and his presence seemed to radiate authority, even in captivity. Enoch knew instinctively who he was. Azazel. The one who had led the Watchers astray, who had shared forbidden knowledge with humankind and turned the world toward chaos. Azazel's gaze met his, sharp and piercing. The air seemed to grow heavier, the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on Enoch like a physical force. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Azazel's voice broke the silence, deep and resonant, carrying a tone that was both weary and defiant. "So," Azazel said, his lips curling into a faint smirk, "this is the one sent to bear witness. Tell me, little mortal, do you come to judge us, or to understand?" Enoch faltered, his voice caught in his throat. Uriel stepped forward, his presence a barrier between them. "You will address him with respect," the angel said, his tone firm. Azazel's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Respect? Do you speak of respect, Uriel, when we were cast down like beasts, our cries unheard, our reasons dismissed? Tell me, what respect was shown to us when the heavens turned their backs?" Uriel's expression remained calm, but there was steel in his voice. "You speak of respect, yet your actions brought ruin upon creation. Your rebellion was not born of reason, but of pride." Azazel's laugh was sharp, bitter. "Pride? Is that what they call it? Or was it the desire to bring light to those who had none? We gave humanity knowledge, the tools to rise above their ignorance. And for that, we were condemned." Enoch stepped closer, his fear tempered by curiosity. "You gave them knowledge, yes," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "But at what cost? The world fell into chaos because of what you taught them." Azazel's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment, the defiance in his eyes softened, replaced by something else. Regret, perhaps, or something deeper. "The cost was not ours to bear," he said quietly. "We offered the gift. It was humanity's choice to use it as they did." Enoch's heart ached at the words, their truth and their distortion intertwining like the chains that bound Azazel. He thought of the suffering he had seen, the corruption that had spread like a plague. The knowledge the Watchers had shared was powerful, but it had been wielded recklessly, without understanding or restraint. Uriel's voice cut through the tension. "You speak as though you were innocent, yet you knew the danger of what you gave. You saw the weakness in humanity, and you exploited it." Azazel rose to his feet, his chains clinking with the movement. His towering form cast a shadow over Enoch, but he did not flinch. "Exploited?" Azazel said, his voice rising. "We saw potential. We saw beings created in the image of the Most High, yet left to stumble in the dark. We gave them fire, the knowledge of the stars, the secrets of the earth. And for this, we were cast out." The Watcher's voice cracked, the anger giving way to something raw, something vulnerable. "We only wanted to create, to shape, as we were shaped. Is that so wrong?" Enoch's voice was soft when he replied. "It is not wrong to create. But it is wrong to create without understanding the consequences." Azazel's shoulders sagged, the weight of Enoch's words settling over him. The defiance in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a weariness that seemed to seep into his very being. He sank back onto the stone, his chains rattling as he moved. "I have asked myself that question every day since we were bound here," Azazel said. "Were we wrong? Were we right? Or were we simply foolish?" The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths and unanswerable questions. Enoch felt a pang of pity for the Watcher, despite the ruin his actions had caused. He thought of the fire, the souls bound to their deeds, and he wondered if Azazel's torment was any different. Uriel's voice was firm but not unkind. "Your choices were yours to make, Azazel. And so are their consequences. The Most High's mercy is great, but it does not erase what has been done." Azazel's gaze dropped to the ground, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he looked up at Enoch, his eyes searching. "You have seen much, mortal. Tell me, what do you believe? Do you see us as monsters, or as victims of a cruel design?" Enoch hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I see you as beings who made a choice," he said finally. "A choice that had consequences, not just for you, but for all creation. I don't know if that makes you monsters or victims. Maybe it makes you both." Azazel's lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps you are wiser than I thought," he said. "Or perhaps you are just naive." Uriel placed a hand on Enoch's shoulder, a silent signal that it was time to go. Enoch turned to leave, but as he did, he glanced back at Azazel. The watcher sat motionless, his chains glinting in the dim light, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the prison that held him. As Enoch stepped away, the shadows of the city seemed to close in, their oppressive weight lingering in his chest. Yet amidst the darkness, he carried with him a glimmer of understanding, a fragment of the truth buried within the fallen watcher's defiance. The air around Enoch crackled with an unfamiliar energy, a strange resonance that seemed to seep into his very bones. He found himself in a vast hall carved into the earth, its walls inscribed with symbols and diagrams that glowed faintly, pulsing as if alive. The space was oppressive, heavy with the weight of knowledge too great for mortals to bear. At the center of the hall stood Uriel, his face grim, his hand resting lightly on a massive stone table etched with markings that seemed older than time itself. "They taught them things they were never meant to know," Uriel said, his voice low, filled with both sorrow and anger. Enoch approached cautiously, his eyes drawn to the strange markings on the table. As he stared, the symbols seemed to shift and writhe, taking on forms he could almost comprehend, shapes of weapons, formulas for destruction, incantations woven with dark intent. His breath caught as he realized what he was seeing. This was no mere record of knowledge, it was a blueprint for chaos. "They called it enlightenment," Uriel continued, his gaze fixed on the table. "They whispered promises of power, of freedom from the limits set by the Most High. And humanity, in their innocence, listened." Enoch's mind raced as he tried to grasp the enormity of what lay before him. He thought of the villages he had passed in his mortal life, the simple lives of farmers and shepherds, and how this knowledge must have transformed them. He saw flashes of fire and steel, of men wielding weapons forged from forbidden arts, their faces twisted with anger and fear. "They taught them to shape metal," Uriel said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "To craft swords and spears, tools of death. They showed them how to call upon the elements, bending the natural order to their will. And they whispered the secrets of the stars, the paths of the heavens, things that were meant to remain hidden." Enoch shuddered as Uriel's words painted a picture of a world unmade by its own hands. The knowledge the Watchers had given was not simply a gift, it was a spark that ignited a blaze, consuming everything in its path. He thought of the fields burned in war, of the cries of mothers and children, of the rivers running red with blood. "It was not only weapons," Uriel continued, his tone softening. "They taught them sorcery, the manipulation of forces beyond their understanding. They showed them how to summon spirits, to bind them to their will. They gave them the knowledge to twist the natural world, to create and destroy with a thought." Enoch's chest tightened as he imagined the weight of this knowledge in mortal hands. He thought of the power it must have given them, the sense of control over a chaotic world. And yet, he could see the cost, lives lost, hearts hardened, the natural balance of creation shattered. As he stood in silence, his mind reeling, he noticed movement in the shadows. A figure stepped forward, a watcher whose presence seemed to fill the hall with an unbearable intensity. His form was both beautiful and terrifying, his eyes burning with a light that seemed to pierce Enoch's very soul. "You think us monsters," the watcher said, his voice resonating like the tolling of a bell. "You think we gave them this knowledge out of malice, out of a desire to see them fall." Enoch did not respond, his voice caught in his throat. The watcher's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was something almost human in his expression, regret, perhaps, or longing. "We did not teach them to harm," the watcher said, his voice quieter now. "We taught them to survive. to defend themselves against the chaos of the world. We gave them fire to keep the darkness at bay, weapons to protect their homes, the stars to guide their paths. Uriel stepped forward, his voice sharp. And what of the destruction they wrought? What of the wars, the bloodshed, the cries of the innocent? Did you not see what would become of your gifts? The Watcher's gaze dropped, his shoulders sagging under the weight of Uriel's words. We saw, he admitted. But we believed they could rise above it. That they could wield the knowledge with wisdom, with restraint. We did not foresee how quickly it would consume them. Enoch's heart ached at the Watcher's words, at the sorrow etched into his face. He thought of the dual-edged nature of knowledge, of how it could bring both creation and destruction. Fire could warm or burn. A blade could protect or kill. Knowledge itself was not evil, but the hands that wielded it could make it so. Did you ever think of taking it back? Enoch asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The Watcher looked at him, his eyes filled with an ancient sadness. By the time we saw the truth, it was too late. The knowledge had taken root, spreading like a sickness. And we were bound, cast down for our transgressions. Uriel's expression was stern as he addressed the Watcher. Your punishment was just. You acted not out of selflessness, but out of pride. You sought to elevate yourselves, to be as gods in the eyes of men. The Watcher's head bowed, his silence an admission of guilt. Enoch felt a pang of pity for him, for all the Watchers who had fallen. They had sought to enlighten, to uplift, but in their pride, they had brought ruin instead. As he turned his gaze back to the table, Enoch felt a strange sense of clarity. The symbols no longer shifted and writhed, they were still, their meaning clear. He saw the potential for both creation and destruction, for growth and devastation. He understood, in that moment, that knowledge was not inherently good or evil. It was a tool, and like any tool, it could be used to build or to destroy. But the weight of that choice lay with those who wielded it. And humanity, in its innocence and its folly, had not been ready to bear it. The hall grew quiet, the tension thick in the air. Enoch turned to Uriel, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. Is there hope? He asked. For humanity, for the world? Uriel's gaze was unreadable, his expression solemn. Hope remains, he said, as long as there are those who seek wisdom, who choose to wield knowledge with humility and care. But the path is fraught with peril, and the consequences of their choices are theirs to bear. Enoch nodded, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had seen and heard. As they left the hall, the glow of the symbols fading behind them, he carried with him a new understanding of the world and of the fragile balance between creation and destruction, wisdom and folly, light and darkness. The wind was hollow, a mournful sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Enoch stood on the edge of a barren valley, its expanse stretching endlessly before him. The ground was ashen, cracked, and lifeless, and the air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the soft, heart-wrenching cries that echoed through the void. The sound was unlike anything Enoch had ever heard, a lament so raw, so filled with anguish, that it seemed to pierce his soul. Uriel stepped forward, his face heavy with an emotion Enoch couldn't quite name. This is where they weep, the angel said quietly, his voice low and reverent. Those who chose neither rebellion nor righteousness. They fell, not in defiance, but in hesitation. And now, they mourn. Enoch's gaze followed Uriel's, and for the first time, he saw them, the angels. Scattered across the valley like shadows, their forms shimmered faintly, flickering between light and darkness. Some knelt, their heads bowed, their hands covering their faces. Others stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the distance, seeing something beyond the veil of time. Their wings, once brilliant and glorious, were tattered, their feathers dulled and broken. He took a hesitant step forward, the weight of their sorrow pressing down on him like a physical force. The cries grew louder as he moved closer, a symphony of despair that seemed to rise from the very ground. Enoch's heart ached with every step, his own tears welling up as the enormity of their grief washed over him. One of the angels turned toward him, her face pale and lined with the shadows of endless regret. Her eyes, once undoubtedly radiant, now held only a dull, flickering light, as if the spark of divinity within her was struggling to survive. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You walk among us, unbroken. Tell me, mortal, what do you seek in this place of sorrow?" Enoch hesitated, unsure how to respond. His voice felt small in the presence of such profound agony. I am here to witness," he said finally, his words faltering. "To understand." The angel's lips quivered, and a single tear traced a luminous path down her cheek. "Understand?" she echoed bitterly. "How can one understand a choice that was never made? I was there, in the moment when the heavens split and the watchers turned their faces from the Most High. And I did nothing. I did not join them, but neither did I stand firm. I hesitated, and that hesitation was my fall." Her words cut through Enoch like a blade, the weight of her self-condemnation almost unbearable. He could see it now, the torment etched into her every movement, the endless replaying of a single moment in her mind. She had not chosen rebellion, nor had she chosen loyalty. In her indecision, she had lost herself. Uriel's voice broke the silence, firm but filled with sorrow. Many of them fell in this way. Fear held them back from standing against the watchers, and pride kept them from reaffirming their place among the faithful. And so, they linger here, caught between light and darkness, their wings too heavy with regret to lift them once more. Enoch knelt on the cracked ground, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the earth. The cries of the angels swirled around him, their pain a living, breathing thing. He thought of his own choices, of the moments in his life where he had hesitated, where fear had silenced his voice. He wondered if he, too, might have fallen, had he been faced with such a monumental decision. Another angel approached, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every step was a struggle. His voice was rough, broken from countless ages of lament. "Do you know what it means to watch the light fade?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Enoch. "To feel it slipping through your fingers like sand, and to know it is your own doing?" Enoch shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. The angel knelt before him, his wings folding inward as if to shield himself from the world. "I was once a guardian of the stars," he said, his voice a fragile whisper. "I carried the light of creation in my hands, guiding it through the heavens. And now, I cannot even bear to look at it. The light reminds me of what I was, of what I lost." The angel's confession broke something within Enoch, and tears streamed down his face. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the angel's shoulder. "Is there no hope for you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The angel flinched at the touch, but did not pull away. "Hope," he said, the word foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I do not know what hope feels like anymore. I only know this: the Most High is just, and in his justice, I am here." Enoch looked to Uriel, desperation in his eyes. "Is there nothing that can be done for them?" he asked, his voice breaking. Uriel's gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, compassion, perhaps, or sorrow. "Their fate is not for us to decide," he said. "Their cries are heard by the Most High, and his judgment is perfect. But their grief is their own, and it is a grief that only they can release." The valley seemed to grow quieter, the angels' cries softening as if they, too, were listening. Enoch felt the weight of their sorrow pressing against his chest, and he knew he would carry this moment with him for the rest of his days. The pain of the angels was a mirror, reflecting the struggles of humanity, the choices made and unmade, the moments of weakness, the wounds inflicted by their own hands. He rose slowly, his knees aching from the hard ground, and turned to face the desolate expanse. The angels remained scattered, their forms fragile against the stark landscape, but there was a strange beauty in their brokenness, a reminder that even in sorrow, there was something sacred. As Enoch and Uriel began to leave the valley, the cries of the angels followed them, a haunting melody of regret and longing. Enoch turned back one last time, his heart heavy but filled with a profound sense of compassion. The angels were lost, but they were not forgotten. Their lament was a testament to their existence, a prayer that, perhaps, one day, they might find peace. The air shimmered with a light unlike anything Enoch had ever seen, soft and golden, as if the sun itself had melted into the fabric of the atmosphere. Each breath he took felt lighter, almost weightless, as though the very essence of this place sought to unburden him. The ground beneath his feet was a carpet of lush greenery, pulsating faintly with life, each blade of grass seemingly infused with an otherworldly glow. In the distance, trees stretched toward the heavens, their branches laden with fruit so vibrant that they seemed to hum with energy. Uriel walked beside him in silence, his expression unreadable but serene. Enoch sensed something sacred here, something beyond the comprehension of even his vivid visions. A gentle breeze whispered through the garden, carrying with it a fragrance so sweet and pure that it brought tears to his eyes. It was as though the very soul of creation had breathed its essence into this place. As they walked, Enoch began to notice the subtle details that set this garden apart from anything earthly. The streams of water that wound their way through the landscape sparkled like liquid crystal, their currents singing a melody that resonated in his heart. Flowers of every color bloomed in perfect harmony, their petals shifting and changing hue as though responding to some unseen rhythm. And above it all, the sky radiated a soft luminescence, not from a sun, but from the garden itself, as if it were alive with divine presence. Enoch paused near a towering tree whose trunk was wider than any building he had ever seen. Its roots burrowed deep into the ground, pulsating faintly as if drawing nourishment from the very heart of creation. The fruit hanging from its branches glowed softly, and just looking at it filled him with an overwhelming sense of peace. He reached out a trembling hand, but Uriel gently stopped him, his touch firm yet kind. "This is the garden prepared for what is yet to come," Uriel said, his voice quiet but filled with reverence. "Here lies the promise of reconciliation, a vision of what humanity may become. It is not yet theirs to touch, but it remains here, waiting." Enoch lowered his hand, his heart pounding with a mixture of awe and yearning. "Why show this to me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why let me see something so perfect?" Uriel's gaze softened, and for a moment, Enoch thought he saw a flicker of sadness in the angel's eyes. "Because you are meant to carry this vision," Uriel said. "It is a reminder that beyond the trials and the pain, there is hope. Beyond the darkness, there is light. And beyond the brokenness, there is healing." They continued walking, and Enoch felt as though the garden itself was speaking to him, not in words, but in feelings and impressions. Each step seemed to bring a new revelation, a new understanding of the divine plan that wove itself through all of existence. He saw figures moving in the distance, their forms radiant and ethereal. They were not angels, nor were they human, but something in between, as if they embodied the best of both. Their presence filled him with a profound sense of joy and peace. As they drew closer, one of the figures turned toward Enoch, and he felt a warmth flood through him, as though he were standing in the embrace of pure love. The figure's eyes met his, and in that gaze, Enoch felt as though all his fears, all his doubts, were laid bare and gently swept away. The being smiled, a gesture so simple yet so profound that it brought him to his knees. "They are the stewards of this place," Uriel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Guardians of the promise, waiting for the day when humanity will be ready to walk here." The figure extended a hand toward Enoch, and though he did not touch it, he felt a current of energy pass between them, a silent communication that spoke directly to his soul. He saw visions of what could be, a world where peace reigned, where humanity lived in harmony with creation, where the wounds of the past were healed and the broken threads of existence were woven together into a tapestry of light. Tears streamed down Enoch's face as the visions faded, leaving him with a sense of longing so intense it ached in his chest. "Will this ever come to pass?" he asked, his voice trembling. Uriel placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch grounding. "That is for humanity to decide," the angel said. "The path has been set before them, but they must choose to walk it. The garden is a gift, a glimpse of what lies beyond the veil of time. But it cannot be forced upon them." Enoch nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He turned to look back at the garden, its beauty so overwhelming that it seemed almost unreal. Yet he knew, deep within, that this place was as real as the ground beneath his feet. It was a promise, a beacon of hope in a world that so often seemed consumed by chaos and despair. They walked on, and Enoch noticed a small pool of water nestled among the trees. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting the garden in its entirety. Drawn to it, he knelt beside the pool and gazed into its depths. At first, he saw only his own reflection, but then the image shifted, showing him scenes of humanity, acts of kindness, of love, of sacrifice. But alongside them were images of war, of hatred, of destruction. The contrast was stark, a reminder of the duality that existed within the human soul. "This is the heart of the divine plan," Uriel said, his voice steady. "Free will. The power to choose. Humanity has been given the greatest gift and the greatest responsibility. They hold within them the potential for both greatness and ruin. And it is this potential that makes them unique, that makes them worthy of the garden." Enoch reached out to touch the water, and as his fingers skimmed the surface, the images dissolved, replaced by a vision of the garden as it might one day be, filled with humanity, their faces radiant with joy and peace. The sight filled him with a sense of hope so profound that it brought a smile to his lips. Rising to his feet, he turned to Uriel, his heart full. The angel met his gaze, and in that moment, Enoch understood. The garden was not just a place, it was a promise, a reminder that no matter how dark the world might become, there was always the possibility of light. And that light, fragile yet unyielding, lay within the hearts of humanity. The air grew heavier as Enoch and Uriel approached the towering silhouette that rose above the horizon. The mountain loomed, its peak shrouded in an unearthly brilliance, a light that seemed to emanate not from the sun but from something far more transcendent. The ground beneath Enoch's feet trembled faintly, as though the earth itself acknowledged the sanctity of this place. A solemn stillness surrounded them, broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind, which carried with it a sound like the faint echo of choral voices, distant but unmistakably divine. Enoch stopped, unable to move as his eyes tried to comprehend the immensity of what lay before him. The mountain was no ordinary formation of rock and stone. Its surface shimmered with hues of gold and silver, a seamless blend that shifted and changed with every glance. Paths spiraled upward, carved not by human hands, but by something eternal, their edges glowing faintly as though imbued with the essence of the heavens. The summit was lost in the radiance, a beacon that pierced through the vastness like a silent proclamation of eternity. Uriel placed a hand on Enoch's shoulder, steadying him. "This is the mountain of the throne," the angel said softly, his voice carrying a weight of reverence. "Here, the divine will is written, and the fabric of existence is shaped. The heavenly tablets lie within." Enoch's chest tightened. He felt as though his mortal frame might break under the sheer magnitude of what awaited. Yet, he nodded, his steps hesitant but determined as they began the ascent. The climb was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Each step felt lighter, as if the mountain itself aided his movement, yet the air grew thinner, charged with an energy that left him trembling. The path wound through shimmering mists that obscured what lay ahead, their ethereal glow casting long shadows on the ground. It was as though the mountain tested him, demanding not strength but humility. As they ascended, the air began to hum with a low vibration, a sound that resonated deep within Enoch's chest. It was not unpleasant but overwhelming, as though the essence of life itself was being sung into existence. The light around them grew brighter, almost blinding, yet it did not sting his eyes. Instead, it seemed to seep into him, illuminating thoughts and emotions he had buried deep within. And then they reached it. The summit stretched out before them, a vast, circular platform that seemed to float above the mountain itself. At its center stood a great structure, part temple, part throne, and part altar, crafted from a material that defied description. It shimmered like liquid starlight, its surfaces reflecting countless facets of existence. Surrounding the structure were towering pillars of flame and cloud, their forms shifting and dancing as though alive. But it was the tablets that drew Enoch's gaze. They rested upon an altar of light, suspended in midair as if held by an unseen hand. The tablets were enormous, their surfaces inscribed with markings that glowed faintly, their patterns alive with motion. The script was unlike anything Enoch had ever seen, yet he felt he could understand it, not with his mind, but with his soul. Each line seemed to pulse with meaning, speaking of lives lived and choices made, of destinies intertwined and paths yet to be forged. Uriel gestured toward the tablets. These record all that has been, all that is, and all that will be. Every act, every thought, every word spoken finds its place here. Nothing is forgotten. Nothing is overlooked. Enoch stepped forward, his heart pounding. As he drew closer, the inscriptions shifted, revealing glimpses of stories, moments frozen in time. He saw a child's first breath, a warrior's final stand, a lover's whispered promise. He saw betrayal and forgiveness, destruction and creation, sorrow and joy. The sheer scope of it was staggering, a tapestry woven from the threads of countless lives, each one vital, each one eternal. His breath caught as he saw his own life etched upon the surface. There he was, a child running through fields of green, his laughter ringing out like a melody. There he was again, older, gazing at the stars with a longing he could not name. And there he was now, standing before the tablets, his face lined with awe and fear. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the glowing surface. In that moment, he felt the weight of every decision he had ever made, every word he had spoken. And yet, he also felt something else, a sense of grace, a reminder that even the smallest acts carried meaning. Uriel's voice broke the silence. Do you see now why the tablets exist? They are not merely records. They are the foundation of all things. Through them, the divine decrees flow, shaping the course of existence. Enoch nodded, though his mind struggled to grasp the enormity of it all. But what of those who stray? Those who choose destruction over creation? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The angel's expression darkened, a shadow passing over his radiant features. Their deeds are written here as well, Uriel said. And their choices weigh heavily upon the balance. Yet, even in their rebellion, there is purpose. Through their actions, the fabric of creation is tested, strengthened. The tablets do not judge, they simply record. Judgment belongs to the one who speaks through them. Enoch turned back to the tablets, his gaze lingering on the inscriptions. He thought of humanity, of its struggles and triumphs, its capacity for both good and evil. The weight of it pressed down upon him, yet within that weight, he found a strange comfort. The tablets did not lie, they bore witness to all, offering neither condemnation nor praise, only truth. As he stood there, a beam of light descended from above, striking the tablets with a brilliance that forced him to shield his eyes. The light grew, enveloping the entire summit, and within it, Enoch felt a presence, a force so vast and incomprehensible that it left him trembling. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face as a voice, neither loud nor soft, but resonant and eternal, filled the air. Behold, the works of my hands, the voice said. Behold, the choices of my creation. Through them, my will is made known, my purpose fulfilled. The light dimmed, and the presence receded, leaving behind a silence so profound that it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Enoch rose slowly, his legs unsteady, his heart pounding. He turned to Uriel, who watched him with a solemn expression. You have seen what few are permitted to see, the angel said. And now you must carry it with you. The knowledge, the understanding, it is not a burden, but a gift. Use it wisely. Enoch nodded, his voice failing him as he cast one last look at the tablets. Their glow seemed softer now, less overwhelming, as though they had accepted his presence. He turned away, the weight of what he had witnessed settling into his heart like a quiet, steady flame. The moment Enoch stepped into the halls of time, the air around him seemed to bend, as if the very fabric of existence had been stretched into something unimaginable. His senses were overwhelmed by a strange sensation of movement, though he remained still. Time itself, it seemed, was in constant motion here, shifting, swirling, and unfolding in every direction. It was not a place, nor was it a space. It was the pulse of creation, the rhythm of all that had been, all that was, and all that would be. The walls of the hall were not solid stone but vast sheets of light, flowing like liquid glass, shifting and warping as if they contained endless streams of images, fragments of lives and histories. Enoch could hear faint whispers, as though the very essence of time was speaking to him, though no words were spoken. His heart beat faster as he gazed at the shifting patterns before him, feeling like he was standing in the center of the universe, where every event, every moment, was unfolding all at once. Uriel, always at his side, stood silent, his face unreadable. "Look," the angel said softly, his voice a quiet reverence in the overwhelming stillness. With a flick of his hand, the wall in front of them shimmered, then split apart like a curtain being drawn. Enoch's breath caught in his throat. Before him lay the first vision. He saw a great flood, the waters rising, engulfing the land. People screamed in panic, their faces twisted with terror as they clung to anything that could save them. The sky was a dark, angry gray, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of 1,000 storms. The sight was so vivid, so real, that Enoch could almost taste the salt of the sea on his lips, feel the desperate cries echoing in his ears. It was not a distant memory, it was alive, unfolding before his eyes. And then, as swiftly as it had begun, the vision shifted. The floodwaters receded, the chaos dissipated, and Enoch found himself staring at a barren landscape. He saw a man, standing alone, gazing toward the horizon. The figure was weary, but there was hope in his eyes, a glimmer of something greater. Enoch could feel the weight of the man's isolation, the burden of his promise, and the sense of something new beginning. This was the man who would rebuild, the one who would carry the memory of a world lost to the waters. But as soon as the image had formed, it was gone, replaced by another. The air around Enoch shifted again, and suddenly, he found himself standing in a dusty village. The sound of a child's laughter echoed in the distance, followed by the soft murmur of a mother calling her children. In the streets, he saw men and women gathered around a figure, a man, humble in appearance, his face serene but determined. His presence was magnetic, drawing people toward him. Enoch's heart ached as he watched the figure speak to the crowds, his words simple yet profound, filled with the promise of salvation. This man was different. His eyes seemed to see everything, to understand the deepest fears and joys of every soul. And as he spoke, there was something unmistakable, an energy in his words that filled the air like a quiet storm. Enoch could feel it too, a deep stirring inside his chest, a hope that went beyond reason. This was the one who would heal the broken world, the one who would offer redemption to those lost in darkness. But before Enoch could fully understand the significance of what he was witnessing, the vision shifted once more. This time, the air was thick with smoke. The earth seemed to crack open, the sky darkened, and the cries of despair filled the air. Enoch could see a great battle, not of men, but of forces unseen. Darkness clashed against light in a struggle that seemed endless. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of the conflict. In the distance, a figure, clad in brilliant light, stood at the edge of the battlefield, arms outstretched, his face filled with both sorrow and determination. The vision was powerful, almost suffocating, as if the end of all things was imminent. Enoch could feel the despair in his bones, the agony of a world teetering on the brink of destruction. Yet, within that darkness, there was also something else, a flicker of light, a spark of hope, so small yet unyielding. This was not the end, not the final word. It was a beginning, a final battle, yes, but one that would lead to renewal. The scene began to fade, the edges of the vision blurring like smoke in the wind, and Enoch was left standing in the hall once more, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. The hall had become still again, the images now resting in the walls like ancient secrets, each one hanging in the air like an unfinished story. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, as he tried to process the flood, the man of hope, the battle between light and darkness. Uriel turned to him, his expression unreadable, but Enoch could see something in the angel's eyes, something akin to sadness, or perhaps understanding. "The past has already been written," Uriel said, his voice low. "It is done." The flood came, and it swept away all that was corrupt. The man of hope has come, and he will come again. And the end is only the beginning. Every story is intertwined. Every life is a thread in the same tapestry. Enoch's heart was pounding now, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what he had seen. The flood. The hope. The battle. He understood now, but only just. He understood that everything, every event, every choice, was part of something much larger than he could ever fully grasp. The end of one thing is merely the start of another, Uriel continued, his voice gentle yet firm. Humanity is caught in a cycle. It is in the hands of each soul to choose which path to walk, the path of light or the path of darkness. And though the end of days may seem terrifying, remember this, it is not the final end. There is always the possibility of rebirth. Enoch nodded, though the weight of the vision hung on his shoulders like a cloak of fire. The flood, the Messiah, the end of days, each moment was a reminder of the fragility of life, the delicate balance between destruction and creation. The hall grew quiet again, the whispers of time fading as the visions settled into their eternal places. And yet, Enoch's heart remained full, trembling with the knowledge that the story of the world, of all worlds, was still being written, with each choice, each act, a line in the great, unfolding tale of existence. The forge burned bright with the heat of 1,000 suns, its light casting an otherworldly glow across the expanse of the workshop. The air itself shimmered with power, thick and alive, like the very essence of creation was being shaped with every breath. Sparks flew like stars in the void, each one a moment in time being molded, each flame a piece of the endless cosmos taking form. Enoch stood in awe before the celestial forge, where the secrets of existence were hammered into being. He had never seen anything like it. The hammer of the angelic smith rang out against the anvils, each strike resounding through the space like a beat of the universe's heart. There were no mortal sounds here, no cries of pain or joy, just the rhythm of creation itself, steady and unyielding. Before him, glowing metal was shaped and twisted into forms both familiar and strange. The heat was unbearable, yet Enoch couldn't look away. This was the place where the stars were born, where souls were forged, where the very foundation of reality was hammered into existence. A figure stood beside the forge, the angelic smith. His wings were vast, like great sails of light, his body swathed in the deep glow of the forge, his face hidden behind a veil of molten metal and radiant fire. The smith worked in silence, his hands precise, movements effortless, as if the act of creation was second nature. Enoch's feet moved forward, as if drawn by an unseen force. He had to understand. What was this place? What was the meaning of all of this? The smith did not look at him, but somehow Enoch knew he was being watched, that the angel knew his every thought. Why do you forge? Enoch's voice felt small against the roar of the forge, but it carried nonetheless. The smith's hands paused for only a moment, then continued their work, his eyes never leaving the flame before him. Because it is the nature of existence. Creation is constant, like the fire itself. To forge is to shape is to give form to what would otherwise remain unknown. Enoch's brow furrowed, the weight of the words pressing against him. But what of destruction? What of those lost in the fires, or those who are never shaped at all? The smith let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, the sound like the wind through the emptiness of space. Destruction, like creation, is part of the cycle. There is no flame without ash, no light without darkness. Without the end, there can be no beginning. What is destroyed will be transformed, reshaped in time. What is never shaped will never be known. Enoch's heart ached at the thought. So many souls, so many lives, were lost to time, left to wander in the dark, never shaped by the divine hand. What of them? Did they have no place in this grand design? The question lingered, heavy, but he dared not ask it aloud. The smith worked steadily, his hammer falling again and again, each strike sending waves of light rippling across the forge. Enoch watched as shapes began to emerge from the glowing metal, stars, suns, and the faint outlines of souls. They spun and twisted in the air, dancing to the rhythm of the forge. Some were brilliant, others dim, some pulsing with energy, others still, waiting for the spark of life to ignite them. What happens to those who are not forged? Enoch finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The smith paused once more, the hammer suspended in midair. He did not look at Enoch, but the weight of his gaze pressed against him. Those who are not forged are lost to the void. They are not a part of the cycle of creation. And yet, even in the void, there is a purpose, a lesson, a warning. Without destruction, there can be no creation. Without absence, there can be no presence. The void shapes as much as the forge does. Enoch felt the truth in those words. He thought of the darkness he had witnessed in his visions, the emptiness that consumed everything in its path. And yet, within that darkness, he saw that there was something waiting. Perhaps the absence itself was a part of the whole, a necessary force in the balance of the universe. The smith resumed his work, the heat of the forge intensifying. Enoch could feel the fire on his skin, yet he remained unmoved, his heart gripped by something deeper. Something told him that this place was not just a forge, but the very heart of all things. Here, stars were born, and souls were shaped. Here, the spark of life began, and the essence of existence was given form. As the smith shaped another piece of metal, it began to glow, a soft blue light emanating from it. The shape became clearer, a soul, delicate and fragile, glowing with a light that was its own. The smith held it up in the air, examining it with care. He did not speak, but Enoch understood. This soul was perfect in its simplicity, its purity. It had been shaped with love, with care. It would go on to live, to learn, to grow, to be part of the grand cycle of creation. How do you know what form to give them? Enoch asked, his voice filled with wonder. The smith's gaze, though hidden, seemed to sharpen. I do not decide the form. The form is inherent within them. I merely uncover it, like a sculptor revealing the statue within the marble. Each soul, each star, each creation has its own essence, its own truth. I simply guide it to its final shape. Enoch's mind raced. So this was how it worked. Every soul, every being, every star had its own truth, its own purpose. And the forge merely revealed it. He thought of the countless souls he had seen, those lost in the flood, those who had suffered in the darkness, and now, standing here, he began to understand. Each soul, in its deepest form, was part of something greater. And in the fire of the forge, it was made whole. The smith's hammer fell once again, and Enoch felt a warmth, a deep knowing in his chest. The cycle of creation was not just a cosmic event, it was a sacred act. The divine forge was not simply about making stars and souls. It was about making meaning, about bringing light into the darkness, about shaping the impossible into something that could be known and loved. For a moment, Enoch stood silent, lost in the awe of it all. He understood now, perhaps more deeply than he ever had before. Existence was a process of becoming, of being shaped, and of shaping. Each soul, like a star, had its place in the grand design, no matter how distant, how lost, or how forgotten. They were all part of the great forge of creation. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The air in the cavern was thick, heavy with an unseen weight that pressed down on everything in its path. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was alive, swirling and shifting, as if it could breathe, as if it could reach out and grab hold of your soul. Enoch's footsteps echoed against the cold stone floor, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence around him. He had entered this place reluctantly, his heart already heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The very air tasted bitter, carrying a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. This was no ordinary cavern. The shadows seemed to move, writhing in the corners of his vision, as though they were waiting, hungry, for something or someone. There was a strange pull in the pit of his stomach, something that made him want to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But he had come too far, and the questions that burned inside him refused to be ignored any longer. He needed to know. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in around him, and it wasn't long before Enoch could hear the faint whispers, like voices carried by the wind, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. The whispers grew until they became full-fledged murmurs, voices filled with pain, anger, and regret. The source of these voices was hidden in the darkness, but Enoch could feel them, could almost touch the weight of their despair. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the dim light. Its form was barely visible, shadowy and indistinct, as if it were made of the very darkness that filled the cavern. A pair of eyes, glowing like embers in the night, watched him from the depths of the gloom. "Who are you?" Enoch's voice trembled as he spoke, but the figure did not respond immediately. It only stood there, its presence oppressive and cold, like the gaze of something ancient, something unforgiving. Enoch took a step back, but the figure's eyes never left him. The whispering voices around him grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like they were all speaking at once. "We are the lost, the forsaken, the ones who were cast aside, the ones who escaped judgment," a voice finally answered from the shadows, rasping and broken. Enoch's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of the spirits who had defied divine judgment, those who had managed to slip through the cracks, but he had never imagined they would feel so real. Their presence was suffocating, like 1,000 souls pressing in on him all at once. The figure stepped closer, its shape becoming more defined, though still a wisp of shadow. "We are the ones who sow misery in the hearts of humanity," it said, its voice low and guttural. "We are the whispers of doubt, the torment of regrets, the fuel of every sin that grows like a weed in the hearts of men. We are the shadows that slip through the cracks of their hearts and minds." Enoch felt a shiver run down his spine. These were the spirits who had escaped judgment, the ones whose influence had infected human suffering. The ones who had whispered lies into the hearts of men, convincing them of their own unworthiness, feeding on their fears and insecurities. These were the spirits that had twisted every good thought into something dark, every loving gesture into a potential weapon. They were the architects of pain, and Enoch understood, in that moment, that the suffering of humanity was not a random act of fate, it was shaped by their hands. They feed on the pain of humans, on their deepest fears, the shadow continued, its voice almost a hiss now. "Every time a person doubts, every time they sin, every time they fall into despair, we grow stronger. We are the shadows of regret and vengeance. And yet, we are not free. We are bound here, in this place of torment, because we have no place in the light." Enoch stood frozen, his heart heavy with the realization of what he was witnessing. The spirits around him were not just figures in the dark. They were the embodiment of human suffering, of the pain and anguish that seemed to echo through history, from the earliest moments of mankind's existence to the present. These were the voices of every wound, every broken heart, every betrayal. They were the ones who had whispered in the ears of kings and queens, causing wars to break out. They were the ones who had crept into the hearts of the innocent, planting seeds of fear, anger, and jealousy. And now they were trapped in this cavern, bound by their own malice, their own darkness. Enoch could feel their presence pressing against him, a weight he could barely comprehend. They were not just suffering, they were trapped in their own cycles of despair, unable to break free from the grip of their own cruelty. As the voices whispered around him, Enoch felt a surge of compassion rise within him. These were not just evil beings, they were souls, too. Souls that had once been whole, once filled with light, but had become consumed by their own hatred, their own pride, their own suffering. He thought of the divine plan he had glimpsed before, the vision of a world where reconciliation and healing were possible. Could even these spirits, so consumed by darkness, be redeemed? "Is there no way for you to be free?" Enoch asked, his voice trembling with emotion. The figure's eyes gleamed with something like regret, but there was no hope in them. "We are bound by our own choices. We cannot undo what we have done. We are the manifestation of human suffering, and as long as the world continues to turn, we will remain. We are the echoes of every bad choice, every wound unhealed. We are the price of rebellion." Enoch's chest tightened with sorrow. The depth of their regret was palpable, but so was their fury. They were trapped not only by their own actions, but by the actions of humanity itself. It was a vicious cycle, one that fed on itself, perpetuating suffering and darkness. The cavern, with its twisting shadows and agonizing whispers, was the prison they had built with their own hands. And yet, in the midst of all this darkness, Enoch couldn't help but feel that somewhere, hidden deep within, there was still a flicker of light. a trace of what these spirits had once been. The possibility of redemption, of healing, still existed. But it was buried beneath layers of bitterness and pain, a burden that only the spirits themselves could bear. Enoch stood there, caught between the anguish of the lost souls around him and the flickering hope that there was still a way to end this cycle of suffering. He didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, he understood one thing clearly: the road to healing would not be easy, but it would begin with acknowledging the darkness and the suffering that had been allowed to grow, and with a willingness to face it head-on. The air grew unbearably thick as Enoch stood on the edge of the vast lake, his heart pounding in his chest. Before him stretched an immense expanse of fire, churning and writhing like a beast trapped in agony. Flames danced across the surface, shooting up in violent bursts, while the air shimmered with heat so intense that it seemed to burn the very soul. The lake of eternal fire. There was no soothing ripple, no gentle sway, only chaos, only destruction. The flames were not a simple fire. They were alive, their heat pressing against Enoch's skin, their heat so intense that his very breath seemed to catch. The lake, an endless abyss of roaring fire, seemed to stretch into infinity. There was no shore, no escape. The wailing began softly at first. At first, Enoch thought it was the crackling of the fire, the sound of it devouring everything in its path. But then he realized the truth: the wailing was the sound of voices. Voices of people in unimaginable agony, voices that echoed across the vastness of the lake, carrying with them an unbearable sorrow. Their cries twisted in the air, rising and falling with the rhythm of the flames. These are the souls of the wicked. Uriel's voice cut through the cacophony of torment. The angel's presence beside Enoch was a calm contrast to the chaos surrounding them. His face was solemn, his eyes clouded with something akin to sorrow, yet his tone remained steady, unwavering. This is their final destination. The place where their deeds and life have led them. Enoch's heart sank. The voices, the suffering. It was unbearable, each wail like a knife to his soul. These were the souls of those who had defied every law, those who had chosen darkness over light, who had walked the path of cruelty, greed, hatred, and malice. They were lost, forever trapped in this lake, burning in a fire that would never cease. Why? Why must they suffer so? Enoch's voice trembled as he spoke, the question hanging in the air. It was a question he had carried with him for so long, but now it felt like a weight he could no longer bear. Uriel's eyes softened, but his voice was firm. It is not a punishment born of cruelty, Enoch. It is the result of their own choices. This fire is not merely a symbol, it is a reflection of the burning desires they harbored in life. Every wrong act, every unrepentant sin, feeds the flames. And so they burn. But this fire is not without purpose. It serves to cleanse what was once corrupt, to purify the soul in its most agonizing form, until there is nothing left but the bare essence of what they once were. Enoch turned his gaze back to the lake. The flames did not relent. The souls trapped within it writhed and twisted in the fire, their forms barely visible, yet their pain was unmistakable. It was as though the fire was devouring them whole, and yet, in a strange, tragic way, it was also allowing them to persist, keeping them trapped in an endless cycle of torment. The wails grew louder as the pain seemed to echo off the very fabric of existence. But can they not be freed? Enoch whispered, his heart aching for the souls that were forever bound to this fate. No, Uriel replied, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. This is their final reckoning. For some, this place is the only way for them to realize the gravity of their choices. The fire does not simply destroy. It refines. It forces them to face everything they have done, to experience the pain they caused others. But there is no way out. It is eternal. Enoch's throat tightened as he looked out over the lake, watching the endless torment unfold before him. Every cry, every wail, was a testimony to a life lived in darkness, and each soul, though lost, had once been a part of the divine plan. They had all been given a choice, and now, as they were consumed by the flames, Enoch could not help but feel an overwhelming sense of grief. Is this the only way? He asked softly, almost to himself, his mind reeling with the implications of it all. The endless suffering, the eternal punishment, was this truly the only path for these souls? Was there no hope for them? Was there no redemption? Uriel did not answer right away. For a moment, he simply stood by Enoch's side, gazing out at the lake as the fire continued its endless dance. Enoch could feel the weight of the angel's silence pressing down on him. Finally, Uriel spoke, his voice quieter now, almost like a whisper in the wind. Perhaps one day, when the end of days arrives, when the new world is born, these souls will be freed from their torment. But until then, they remain here, in this place. It is a part of the divine order. A necessary balance. There must be a reckoning for every action, every choice. The universe cannot exist in chaos. Without consequences, there can be no harmony. Without fire, there can be no purification. And without judgment, there can be no justice. Enoch closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it all settle deep within him. The fire, the torment, the suffering, it was a truth he hadn't been ready to face. And yet, there it was, laid bare before him, an undeniable reality. The wicked, those who chose to walk in darkness, would be consumed by the very flames they had fed in life. The fire did not simply burn, it reflected the choices they had made, and it was a mirror they could never escape. As he stood there, watching the souls twist in the fire, Enoch felt something shift within him, a sense of understanding, but also a deep sorrow. He had hoped for a different ending, for some glimmer of redemption, even in the darkest of places. But there was no easy answer, no quick salvation. The road to redemption, for some, was long gone, and the only thing that remained was the fire, the purifying, relentless fire that would burn away everything, until only the barest trace of what they once were remained. The flames roared louder as if to answer Enoch's thoughts, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of the divine order, the immense balance that held the universe together. In this place of eternal fire, there was no escape. Only reckoning. Only purification. And as he turned away, a sense of heaviness settled over him. The journey had led him here, to this lake, to this truth. And now, he understood. The silence was crushing. Enoch stood at the threshold of a vast hall, the weight of its emptiness pressing against his chest. It was a space carved in shadow, dimly lit by a sickly light that flickered like the dying embers of a long-forgotten fire. The air was thick with grief, an overwhelming sorrow that seemed to hang in every corner of the room. Here, there were no walls, no windows, only an endless expanse of black marble floors stretching out beneath him, gleaming cold and polished. At the far end of the hall, on empty thrones draped in tattered robes of faded gold and black, sat the fallen rulers. Once proud, once majestic, now reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. These were the angels who had once held power and glory, the ones who had stood at the heights of creation. Now, their eyes, once bright with purpose, were dulled with regret. Their faces were worn with the weight of their decisions, their heads hanging low, as if they could not bear to meet the gaze of anyone who might walk into this forsaken place. One by one, they stared at Enoch as he stepped further into the hall, each of them locked in their own private torment, each mourning the loss of what they had once been. The thrones they sat on were cold, abandoned, their grandeur stripped away, replaced by the dull reality of their fall. "Why do you come here, mortal?" The voice was rough, ragged, like a tortured whisper. It came from the throne at the far left, where one of the rulers sat, his wings tattered and hanging limply behind him. His eyes, once filled with divine fire, now seemed to flicker like the last light of a dying star. Enoch did not answer immediately. His eyes swept over the rulers, each one had been powerful in their own right, each had ruled with authority, and yet here they were, broken, lost. He could feel the weight of their sorrow wrapping around him, pressing down on his heart. This was not just a place of punishment, it was a prison of regret, of lives undone, of everything they had been reduced to. "I come because I must understand," Enoch said finally, his voice steady, though the sight of the fallen rulers stirred something deep inside him. "What happened to you? How did it come to this?" The angel who had spoken to him let out a bitter laugh, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. "You wish to understand? Do you truly believe there is understanding in this place? There is only loss. Only pain. Enoch felt the fire in the angel's words, the anguish that laced every syllable. Still, he pressed forward, his heart aching for them. You were once among the highest, he said softly. You once held thrones in the heavens. Why would you throw it all away? A murmur of agreement rippled through the other fallen rulers. Their heads lifted slightly, eyes filled with the same sorrowful recognition. One of them, his wings barely more than tattered feathers, spoke next, his voice heavy with the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. We sought more, he said. More than what was given. We wanted to shape the universe, to rule not just as servants but as equals, to see the world bend to our will. We believed that by casting off the chains of obedience, we could rise higher. But we were wrong. We fell, and in our fall, we dragged everything with us. Enoch's heart twisted. He could hear the shame in their words, but also the anger, the bitterness. They had sought power, and in their desire, they had lost everything. And now, he asked, now that you've lost it all, what remains? Is there any hope for you? The room fell still. The rulers looked at each other, their eyes filled with unspoken words. After a long pause, the ruler on the central throne spoke, his voice cold and resigned. Hope? What is hope when all that is left is regret? What is hope when you have already sealed your fate? We chose to rebel. We chose to defy the order, and now we must live with the consequences. There is no redemption for us. Enoch's heart ached at the finality in their words. He had hoped, deep down, that there might be some way out for them, some path to healing, but he could feel the truth settling in. This place was not merely a punishment, it was their eternal reality, a prison of their own making. But is that all there is? Enoch's voice trembled with the weight of his question. Is it too late for you to repent? The ruler who had spoken before leaned forward, his face twisted with anguish. You ask of repentance, he said, his voice low and hoarse. But we have seen too much to ever return. Repentance is not a gift we can take. It was given to us once, but we turned our backs on it. We chose pride over humility. We chose power over peace. Enoch felt his chest tighten. The weight of their words was too much, too heavy for him to bear. But even so, he pressed on. But is there no chance left? No chance to make amends for what you've done? Another ruler, his once glorious wings now a twisted mess of ash and bone, spoke with a bitterness that seemed to burn the air around them. What would you have us do, mortal? You ask of repentance as if it were something we could easily grasp. It is not that simple. Our fall was not just a mistake, it was a choice to embrace power over humility. And now we are left with nothing but the emptiness of our actions. Enoch felt the sting of their words, but something deep inside him still refused to believe that there was no way back. He looked at them, all of them, and saw not just fallen angels, but beings who had once known the light, who had once been part of something greater than themselves. You may have fallen, Enoch said, his voice soft but steady. But you were not created to be lost forever. You were created for something more. A silence followed, thick with the weight of his words. The fallen rulers seemed to recoil, their eyes narrowing. Some of them averted their gaze, unwilling to face the truth that Enoch had dared to speak. We were created for greatness, one of them finally said, his voice tinged with bitterness. But we chose another path. And now, that greatness is a distant memory. Enoch looked at them, his heart heavy with sorrow for what they had become. You are not beyond redemption, he said quietly. You still have the spark within you. You can still choose. The choice is yours, no matter how far you have fallen. But the rulers only sighed, their eyes distant, as if the very idea of hope was something foreign, something they could no longer comprehend. They were lost in their own despair, trapped in the hollow space between what they had been and what they had become. And so, as the hall fell into silence once more, Enoch stood there, caught between the despair of their fallen thrones and the fragile hope he had tried to offer. The weight of their regret hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt, as each of them remained trapped in their own sorrow. The silence at the edge of existence was deafening. Enoch stood at the boundary, the place where nothingness stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. A cold wind brushed his face, carrying with it the faintest whispers of lost souls, souls that had slipped past judgment, souls that were no longer remembered, no longer cared for. The air felt thinner here, as if even the very breath of life had been forgotten, swallowed up by the abyss that lay just beyond his reach. He could see it, a dark, endless expanse that seemed to shimmer and ripple like a veil of smoke, stretching into nothing. It was not the stillness of peace, it was the stillness of despair. It was the final destination for those who had turned their backs on redemption, who had pushed away the very mercy that could have saved them. It was the place where they would fade, not into hell, not into fire or torment, but into the sheer nothingness of non-being. There were no cries, no flames, no screams. Just a vast emptiness that swallowed everything. The souls who drifted here did not burn, they simply disappeared, as if they had never been at all. The weight of that knowledge hit Enoch like a physical blow. To fade into nothingness, to become forgotten, was worse than any punishment. It was as if they had never existed, as though their lives had meant nothing. The thought made Enoch's chest ache. He felt the coldness creep further into his bones, the weight of eternity pressing down on him. The boundary of oblivion was not a place of destruction. It was worse. It was a place where everything, their joys, their struggles, their dreams, would be erased from the universe. As if their souls were never meant to matter. It was here that the line between mercy and judgment blurred. Enoch looked around, searching for any sign of those who had been condemned to this fate. But there was nothing. No faces, no forms. Only shadows, barely perceptible, fading into the dark. He thought of the countless souls he had encountered, each one carrying a story, a past, a purpose that had once been theirs. And now, they were nothing. The weight of that finality was unbearable. It was one thing to be punished. It was another to be forgotten. He stepped closer to the edge, his eyes scanning the void. His heart felt heavy with a sorrow that he couldn't fully understand. How could it be fair? How could it be right to erase someone, to deny them even the faintest trace of existence? His mind began to swirl with questions, questions he knew he would never have answers to. There were no simple answers in a place like this, no easy explanations. Yet, he could hear a voice, faint and distant, rising from the depths of his thoughts. It wasn't a voice from any soul or spirit, it was his own. A quiet whisper that asked the question he had been avoiding: is this what justice demands? Mercy and judgment, two forces that could never be separated, two forces that defined everything. Mercy had its place, its warmth, its hope. But judgment was cold, unyielding, and final. It was the line that could not be crossed, the moment when a soul had turned too far from the light, when there was no more hope, no more redemption. Judgment was the end. The end of everything. Enoch shuddered as the thoughts pressed against him, the darkness before him growing deeper. He had seen it before, the way souls arrived at this place, their faces, their eyes filled with despair, realizing that their chances had long passed. He had seen the way their hope flickered and died, the way their lives unraveled into the blackness of nothingness. It wasn't punishment in the way most would understand. There were no flames to scorch them, no demons to torment them. It was simply the fading away, the quiet slipping into nothing. The finality of it was more terrifying than any pain or torment could ever be. The thought of it, the idea that one could be erased from existence, filled Enoch with a sorrow that seemed to go beyond his own understanding. He glanced down at his hands, as if hoping to find something that could anchor him, some truth, some understanding that could help him make sense of it all. He thought of all the souls he had witnessed, those who had been lost, those who had turned their backs on the light, who had chosen selfishness, cruelty, and pride over kindness and love. He thought of the fallen rulers, the angry spirits, the lost ones who had refused to repent, and yet he still couldn't shake the question: how could this be their end? His thoughts were interrupted by a low hum, a sound that seemed to resonate from the very core of the void. The hum grew louder, a strange vibration that seemed to pull him in. It was as though the void itself was speaking, offering no answers, only the unsettling feeling that he was trespassing in a place he had no right to be. The hum grew louder still, until it became a voice, faint but unmistakable. Uriel's voice, cold and distant, yet filled with the weight of wisdom that could only come from seeing the end of all things. "Do you feel it, Enoch?" Uriel asked, his voice like the rustle of ancient wings. "The balance between mercy and judgment. It is the most delicate of all balances. Mercy seeks to restore, to heal, to give second chances. Judgment seeks to set things right, to correct the wrongs, to ensure that those who choose darkness cannot spread it further." Enoch's heart trembled at the words. He could hear the truth in them, but it did not make it easier to accept. He was standing on the edge of oblivion, and in the distance, he could feel the pull of both mercy and judgment, fighting for dominance. How could one decide? How could one judge when every soul, no matter how lost, had once been filled with light? "You see it, don't you?" Uriel's voice continued, sorrowful yet resolute. "There are souls who have crossed too far. Souls who have chosen this path. They are not forgotten by the heavens, but their choices have led them to this place. The very essence of existence has been torn asunder by their refusal to turn back. Here, at the edge, all that remains is the balance. Mercy has done what it can, but judgment must follow. There is no other way." The words echoed in Enoch's mind, settling heavily in his heart. The balance between mercy and judgment, it was something he had always believed in. But standing here, at the very edge of existence, with nothing but the empty expanse of oblivion before him, he felt the crushing weight of that truth. It was not a simple choice. It was not a clean answer. It was the difference between holding on and letting go. Between love and loss. Between hope and despair. As the hum of oblivion grew louder, Enoch found himself standing at the crossroads of all that he had learned, all that he had come to understand. And he realized, with a slow, painful clarity, that sometimes the hardest choice was the one that had no clear answer. Sometimes, the balance between mercy and judgment was not something that could be decided. It simply had to be felt. And in that feeling, there was a truth that only the soul could comprehend. The air was still as Enoch stood before the towering structure. It rose before him, a radiant spire of light that seemed to pierce the very heavens themselves. The Tower of Ascension, a place where only the most determined could ever hope to reach the summit. It was not just a tower of stone and light, it was a bridge, a path, a promise. A path leading back to the divine, to something purer, something beyond all that had weighed him down in his journey. The air shimmered with a soft glow, as though the very atmosphere was alive, breathing with life. A cool breeze swept past, carrying with it a sense of peace, a gentle comfort that calmed his weary soul. Enoch's heart beat faster, a mix of awe and apprehension filling him. He had seen much on his journey, far more than any mortal should ever know, and now, here, before the Tower of Ascension, he felt an unfamiliar weight lift from his shoulders. It was as though the very act of standing here, in this place, was a step toward something far greater than he could understand. He looked up the tower, its light so bright that he had to squint. The ascent ahead would not be easy. But something within him, deep within his heart, told him that this was a step he must take. The tower called to him, a silent pull, like the softest whisper urging him forward. With a deep breath, Enoch stepped onto the first rung of the luminous ladder, its surface glowing beneath his feet. As he ascended, he felt a surge of warmth, as though the very light of the tower was embracing him, welcoming him into its fold. Each step was a heartbeat. Each breath was a prayer. The world seemed to fall away beneath him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Enoch felt light, free. As he climbed higher, visions began to flicker before his eyes, as though the tower itself was unveiling pieces of a larger truth. He saw flashes of faces, familiar ones, long forgotten. People who had once walked with him on earth, people who had made choices, who had loved and lost, who had been bound by the same struggles he had faced. Their faces shifted and blurred, but their emotions remained clear: sorrow, hope, regret, love. He saw the face of a child, pure and innocent, whose eyes shone with an eternal light. The child's laughter echoed in his mind, a sound so pure, so untainted by the darkness of the world, that it nearly brought tears to his eyes. And with it came a vision of a world restored, a world where love was the guiding force, where kindness overcame cruelty, and where joy could be shared by all. The tower seemed to pulse with the promise of that world, and Enoch's heart quickened. Each vision revealed another piece of the truth, the redemption that awaited those who sought it, the grace that could heal all wounds, the restoration of all that had been broken. It was as if the tower was showing him the divine plan, a plan that stretched beyond time and space, beyond the struggles of the human heart. And then, as he climbed higher still, the visions grew stronger, clearer. He saw a mighty river flowing through a vast and verdant land, its waters pure and untainted. People gathered beside it, their faces lifted to the sky, their hands open, receiving the gift of grace that flowed from the river. It was a vision of restoration, a vision of the world healed, of every broken heart mended, of every sin forgiven. But there was more. The visions also showed him the cost of that restoration. Enoch saw the sacrifice that had been made, the price paid for the redemption of all. He saw a figure, radiant and strong, standing before a crowd, offering the greatest gift of all, the gift of love, given freely, without hesitation, without limit. He saw the pain that love had endured, the suffering that had been borne for the sake of the world. His heart clenched in his chest as the figure in the vision, the one who had offered that love, turned toward him. It was the same child he had seen before, grown now, with eyes filled with both compassion and sorrow. And Enoch understood, in that moment, that the path to redemption was not without cost. That even as the world could be restored, even as the hearts of mankind could be healed, it would not come without sacrifice. And yet, the light that filled the tower was not a light of despair. It was a light of hope. A light that said, "It is worth it," a light that said, "There is always a way forward, no matter the weight of the past, no matter the darkness that had once seemed to swallow everything. There was always a path that led back to the light." Enoch's steps grew more certain, each one a beat of resolve as he neared the top of the tower. The air around him began to hum with a deep, resonating sound, like the pulse of the universe itself. It was the sound of all things coming into alignment, the sound of the divine plan being fulfilled. The very walls of the tower seemed to glow brighter, the light filling every corner of his soul, offering him a peace he had never known. When he reached the top, he stood at the very edge, the sky before him wide and endless, filled with a brilliance that stretched beyond comprehension. His heart swelled as he looked out over the horizon. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, truly known. There, at the top of the tower, he was no longer just Enoch, the man who had walked through the darkness. He was Enoch, the one who had ascended, the one who had embraced the light. And in that light, he saw everything clearly. The vision of the restored world. The hope of redemption for every soul, no matter how lost, no matter how broken. It was all there before him, in a single, eternal moment. The promise of restoration was not just a dream, it was a reality, a truth woven into the very fabric of existence. The tower had shown him that no matter the suffering, no matter the darkness that had come before, the divine plan was always moving forward. Always bringing light where there had once been none. And as Enoch stood there, bathed in the glow of the tower, he knew, without a doubt, that the promise of redemption was not just for a few, it was for all. For everyone. For every soul that had ever walked the earth, no matter the path they had chosen, no matter the mistakes they had made. There was always hope. There was always a chance to return to the light. With a heart full of both peace and joy, Enoch stepped forward, knowing that the tower had led him home. The light, once distant, now surrounded him completely, and he knew that he was no longer alone. He had ascended, yes. But more importantly, he had found the way back to everything he had ever longed for. The promise of redemption, the truth of restoration, it was all here, all real, all within his reach. And as he stood there, a part of him knew that this was only the beginning. Enoch stood on the threshold, the land before him stretching out like a canvas, waiting for his return. The world he once knew had not changed in his absence, yet everything felt different. The air felt thicker, the weight of the knowledge he carried pressing against his chest. He had walked through realms of light and darkness, seen things no mortal was ever meant to see, and now, as he stood on the cusp of his return, he felt the burden of his journey like never before. His feet touched the earth once more, and he breathed in the familiar scent of the land, the rich earth, the fresh air, the whispers of life that stirred all around him. The world felt the same, but his place in it had changed. The wisdom he had gained, the secrets he had witnessed, burned inside him. He could not forget what he had seen. He would not forget. The weight of that knowledge hung over him like a shadow, not a burden to be cast aside, but something to carry, something to share. He could not return to his people as the man he once was. He was different now, transformed. What he had learned, the glimpses of the unseen, the moments of beauty and despair, all needed to be shared. The visions, the lessons, the truths hidden in the corners of existence, he could not allow them to fade away into nothingness. He walked with purpose through the familiar paths, his mind swirling with the images that had burned into his soul. The faces of angels, both fallen and unfallen, the cries of those who had wandered too far from grace, the glimpses of a future that offered hope and redemption, even for those who had turned their backs on it. He had seen the end, but more importantly, he had seen the beginning again. The chance for renewal. When he reached his home, the people gathered around him, their eyes filled with wonder and confusion. They knew he had been gone for so long, but they could not fathom where he had been, what he had seen. Enoch felt their eyes on him, but he did not feel fear. There was something in his gaze now that made them pause, something that spoke of depths too vast for them to understand. He sat down, pulling out a simple scroll, a tool to record what he had witnessed. The weight of the task ahead of him felt heavy, but it was a burden he was willing to carry. Each word he wrote, each stroke of the pen, felt like a release, a sharing of something sacred. It was not just his knowledge that he carried now. It was the knowledge of the unseen realms, the realms that had shown him both the glory and the tragedy of existence. And he would not let it slip away into the ether. He wrote about the rivers of fire he had crossed, where the deeds of the wicked were reflected in the burning currents. He wrote about the Watchers and their rebellion, the moments of their regret, and the lessons they had yet to learn. He wrote about the forbidden knowledge, the sorcery and the weapons of war, that had changed the course of humanity. He wrote about the angels trapped in sorrow, the fallen rulers who had once commanded armies of light, now reduced to shadows of their former selves. He wrote about the cavern of shadows, where the malevolent spirits waited, carrying with them the burdens of their choices. He wrote about the lake of eternal fire, the final destination of the wicked, and the whispers of judgment that echoed in its flames. But even in the darkest of places, he also wrote of the light that shone through, of the hope that remained even when all seemed lost. He wrote of the Tower of Ascension, the promise of redemption and restoration, and the vision of a world where peace and love would reign once more. And the halls of time, where past, present, and future collided in a single moment, showing him the path that humanity would take. But most of all, he wrote of the truth he had seen, the divine plan that stretched across time, a plan not for the few, but for all. For every soul, every heart, every life. The knowledge he had gained was not for himself alone, it was for them, for his people, for every generation that would come after him. As the ink flowed from his pen, Enoch's heart felt lighter, though the weight of the knowledge remained. His soul was both at peace and filled with longing, a longing to see the world he had glimpsed restored to its true glory. He knew that his writings would not bring that vision to life on their own. But they were a start. They were a seed. And perhaps, with time, they would grow into something that could change the world. A simple record of a journey, a record that could awaken something deep within the hearts of others. The sun began to set as he finished his writing, and Enoch stood, looking out over the land. The world was quiet now, the distant sound of a bird's call echoing in the evening air. He could feel the connection between himself and the earth beneath his feet, the pulse of life that ran through it all. His people, still gathered around him, were silent now, reading the words he had written. Each one of them would carry this knowledge, just as he would. It was a bond that stretched beyond the pages, a bond between generations, between the past and the future. The knowledge was no longer his alone. It was for them all. The words he had written would live on. They would echo through time, reaching into the hearts of those who needed them most. Enoch knew that his work was not done. It was only just beginning. And though he could not see the future with certainty, he knew that the promise of redemption was real. That the light of hope would always be there, even in the darkest of times. As he looked out at the horizon, a soft breeze picked up, carrying with it the promise of something new. A new beginning. A new chance. He smiled, knowing that even in the face of all the suffering and the darkness, there was always the possibility of a new dawn. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth would continue. And with it, the hope of redemption, the light of love, and the grace of mercy would always shine through.